Hello, my name is Todd Miranda, and the purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate how to implement property triggers in a style in a WPF Windows application. Let's begin by creating a new WPF Windows application project, and we'll call this Property Triggers. In WPF, we can create styles for our elements, and our styles can have what's called triggers, which activate on certain data being set, certain properties being set, or certain events occurring. Let's begin by adding a couple elements to a form so that then we can apply a property trigger to see why we would apply a property trigger and how we would do that. Let's start with our grid and let's create some column definitions. And for this example, we'll just have two columns. The first column will have a width that is set to auto. That's so that it'll auto size to fit its contents. And then we'll have the second column, which will have a width of star. And that means it's going to take up all the remaining space. So this is kind of a typical layout where you might have some type of layout elements on your left-hand side so that your column would be sized automatically, and then the remaining grid would contain the rest of your application. So let's see what we would do here. Let's have a stack panel be in our first column, and columns are 0 based, so we'll just put a 0 here, and we'll go with the default vertical orientation of a stack panel. And let's create a button, and we'll give this button just simply some content, and we'll call that first button. And we'll create a few of these. So we might have some buttons to use as our navigation elements for our application. And we want to apply a style to these buttons. So we know that we can come in here, and within our button we can do a button.style, and the button.style needs to be a style block, so we'll create a style block. And then in our style block we have some setters, and these are used to set particular property values. So we're going to set the property, we'll set the background property, and we'll set its value to blue. Now, if I compile this, we'll see that it won't work. And the reason why it won't work is the style cannot resolve the style property background. And that's because although our style block is within the button.style property, the style does not know that this style is for a button. So we have two options. We could specify that this is the button.background property that we want to set, or we could say that this style has a target type of button. So we'll go that route. So now all these setters will know that they're being applied to a particular button. So we can build, and we get a successful build, and we can run this to see our buttons. And you see that we've styled our first button to where it has a blue background. So in our second column, we'll just have a rectangle for now, and we'll specify this is in our second column. We want the horizontal alignment to stretch and the vertical alignment to stretch so that it stretches to fill the entire space that it's given. And we'll set its fill to color aquamarine, and we'll give it maybe a radius X of 5 and radius Y of 5, just to give it a nice rounded border. Okay, so let's take a look now at our application. You see that we've got our grid now that stretches to take up the remaining space, and then we've got a fixed column over here that contains our buttons. So we've got this first button styled, and we'd like to style the other buttons to match it. So instead of applying this same style to all the buttons, what we can do is take this style block, and we'll cut that right out, and we'll go up here. Now we could apply this style at the window level or at the grid level. We could come in here and do a window.resources and specify that we want this style to be part of the resources of the window, or we could do grid.resources and specify that it's a resource of the grid, and we'll do that. And that way we limit the scope of our style just to the grid. So we'll do a grid.resources, and we'll put that style block in here. So again, here we have two options. We can specify a key for this style, and then down below, anywhere we want to use that style, we can use a static resource and specify that key for the style of that element. Or if we just leave the target type set to button, all buttons within our grid will be styled using this style, and we'll go that route. So we've moved our style block into our grid.resources so that this style will be available as a resource to this grid. We've created the style and set its target type equal to button and not specified a key, so all buttons will now be affected by the style, and we've set the property in the style background to blue. So let's go back down here to our button, and we can remove our style block there, and let's run the application. So now you can see that we've styled all of our buttons, and we have our rectangle that's stretching horizontally and vertically. But you see that the mouse over is not very interesting here. And if we're really trying to build an application where we've got a lot of richness and a lot of interaction, we might want more than just this standard indicator that you're hovering over a button. So let's do a couple of things. The first thing that we want to do is set another property just to give us a little bit of space between our buttons. We'll set the margin, and the value of our margin will be, let's set a 2-pixel margin on the left. Maybe we'll do a 3 on the top, a 2 on the right, and then a 3 on the bottom. So that'll give us plenty of space in between our buttons and a little bit of space between the top button and on the sides. Now, in a style block, we also have something called triggers. So let's create a style.triggers block, and within our style.triggers block we can have multiple types of triggers. So if we look at the IntelliSense, we can see that we've got data triggers, which are used to trigger off of data that's bound to that particular control. We've got an event trigger, which should make sense in that this trigger is triggered on a particular event. Then we've got these multi-data triggers, so you can have multiple trigger data points that occur before that trigger is actually activated. And we've got a multi-trigger, which means that you've got multiple trigger conditions that have to be met before that trigger is activated. And then of course we've got just the plain trigger. So for purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about property trigger. So we're going to use just a regular trigger, and we're going to specify that the property that we want to trigger on is called is mouse over. And we want to specify that the value is true. So now we've created a trigger block, and we specified that the property that we want this trigger block to watch is the isMouseOver property. When the isMouseOver property is true, we want something to happen. So we can come in to our trigger block and we can create property setters, and in this case we'll set the background to, we'll say red. That'll be a pretty dramatic difference. So again, our property trigger is watching the isMouseOver property. When its value is true, it will set the background to red. So let's run this and see how that looks. So now you can see that as we hover over our buttons such that our isMouseOver property is true, the trigger is activated and the background property is set to red. But the one other thing that you'll notice is that when we move the mouse away from the button, thusly the isMouseOver property changes back to false, the button doesn't stay red. But we didn't write a trigger that said isMouseOver equals false, set the background property to another value. One of the really nice things about triggers is that when you use a property trigger and you're watching a particular property, its value changes to the value that you want to be the trigger condition. The setter is activated. When the value is no longer the active condition value, the setter is effectively unset. So the background is set back to its previous state, or what's really happening is this particular property set is being removed so that the original condition takes place. So this is how we could implement property triggers, and we can have multiple triggers occur on the same element. We could use a multi-trigger to have multiple conditions occur before a particular action is taken, and all of this can go inside of our style block. And the style block does not have to necessarily be attached directly to the element. It can be up in a resources block, whether that be a more localized resource or a more global resource like your window or your application resources.